Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 15th episode of Facts on the Ground. We are very pleased today, Misty Winston, my co-host as always, and I, to have as our guest, Moss Robeson. He's an independent journalist and researcher who's written for and published in The Gray Zone, and whose work is primarily focused on the Ukrainian diaspora, as well as the neo-Nazi and fascist elements that have been increasingly pervading that diaspora. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to go into some history of how that came to be and bring it up to date to where things are now with neo-Nazi and fascist groups in Ukraine and their connections to U.S. think tanks and other entities. So, Moss, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So, Moss, obviously, Ukraine's a very complicated, complex discussion to have, and we don't have enough time to really get into every nuance. But we did want to kind of start with getting sort of like a history, kind of taking a look back at where, maybe about World War II, and just kind of give our viewers, who are maybe not familiar, just a little bit of the backstory. If that's okay with you, obviously. Can you just kind of give us sort of, starting with World War II, sort of the situation that, Ukraine, Russia, and, everything, where everybody kind of stood at that point?
Yeah, well, I think maybe the first thing to start with is that the nationalists and the Banderites and related Ukraine far right really kind of derives from Western Ukraine, which up until, except for briefly, during World War I, it was under Polish and Austrian rule for hundreds of years, and so it was, it remained it was part of interwar Poland until the Nazis and Soviets partitioned Poland, and the Ukrainian part of Poland went to Soviet Ukraine. And so it was in interwar Poland that this nationalist movement really kind of took off. And, it, as I mentioned, has this Austrian influence as well. And it was like it still is like the most European oriented part of Ukraine. And during the 30s, the nationalist movement, became increasingly oriented towards Nazi Germany and fascism and just anti-Semitic ideology. And, there was a strategic element, but there was also an ideological affinity. And so the hope of Ukrainian nationalists in Western Ukraine or interwar Poland was that the Nazis would help them liberate Ukraine and create this basically a client state of the Nazis. And there was like a faction within the Nazi leadership that supported that, Alfred Rosenberg being like the number one. But at the end of the day, Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, Göring, the top people, they had no interest in liberating Ukraine. Of course. So, the nationalists and who collaborated with the Nazis, later claimed that they were anti-Nazi, but in truth, the Nazis were just anti-Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm. So, along those lines, can you talk about Stepan Bandera, who he was, and his legacy today?
So Bandera was born January 1st, 1909. So he was born, within the Austrian Empire in, Western Ukraine. And he, like others of his generation who become involved in the OUN, were the sons of a nationalist priest. And he was also of this generation that was just grew up as a kid during World War One and soaked in all this nationalism. And by the time that the OUN was founded in 1929, he became a founding member of it, and very quickly rose in the ranks. And he was then 1934. In 1934, he and the OUN orchestrated their highest profile assassination to date, which was of the Interior Minister of Poland. And he then was sentenced to death for it, but then that was commuted to life imprisonment. And he was either freed or escaped when World War II broke out.
Mm-hmm.
And so then there was this kind of these two sort of generations within the OUN of the people who created it were these World War I veterans who fought mostly alongside Austria, and then fought for a Western Ukrainian republic. When World War I ended, they continued that fight, and they lost to the Poles, and then went underground with this basically terrorist movement organization called the Ukrainian Military Organization, which spearheads the creation of the OUN. And
sorry to interrupt, but just for our viewers, the OUN is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists.
Yes. And so then Bandera becomes basically the leader of this kind of new, younger generation. And so after he's freed or escapes from prison, he challenges the new leader of the OUN, and essentially it breaks off into two factions. And so Bandera becomes the leader and creator of the OUNB, or they call themselves the Revolutionaries faction of the OUN, but the B is, clearly for Bandera. And so, and Bandera, he's rightfully so, really controversial, divisive figure in Ukrainian history, but, he's kind of had this, his legacy has kind of had this massive revival in Ukraine in the last 5-6 years or so, and but it kind of largely started with in 2010. I think that was kind of like a watershed moment, is when the president of Ukraine, one of the last things he did in office was declare Bandera a hero of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And so that's been this controversy.
Who was the president at that time?
Viktor Yushchenko. He's the one who was brought to power by the Orange Revolution.
Right. That color revolution.
Yeah.
And it's actually to the point now, you said it's gotten worse in the past several years. They're now having these plays and celebrations of Bandera kind of annually in Ukraine, which is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the torchlit marches are something, especially in this country with with Joe Biden basically running on the whole Charlottesville thing, mm-hmm. and the tiki torches, and then looking the other way to tiki torches in Ukraine. So yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about this play, Rebel Vertep, that's put on around Christmas time in Ukraine by a group called the MNK, which is the Youth Nationalist Congress? They put mm-hmm. on a play not just celebrating Bandera and Ukrainian fascists and neo-Nazi supposedly revolutionaries, but it's also a play that is explicitly intended to be anti-Semitic and denigrate Jews as less than vermin.
Yeah, and it's like they would say, "Oh, what? We don't do anything of that sort." But it's kind of hard to deny the anti-Semitism when you watch it. The Youth Nationalist Congress was created in 2001 on behalf of. The way they put it is, it was created on the initiative of the OUNB, which relatively few people realize still exists. It's different today, but it does still exist and is still influential. And, I think this is their main primary foothold in Ukraine today, is this youth group. and the current head of this youth group is the one who co-authored this script back in, I think, 2008. And the play is it's an appropriation of like a traditional anti-Semitic or traditional Ukrainian plays which have an anti-Semitic element to it, kind of like a Christmas caroling type thing, but then you might have like a cut to a little skit of someone dressed up Jewish, and
Moshko.
yeah, and so in this play, that's the name of the Jewish character, and it's, I don't know, it's a sight to behold, because the current day OUNB and the Banderites, they insist that, you know, Bandera wasn't a Nazi collaborator, and if anything, he fought the Nazis, and they didn't kill Jews, they saved them. And yet in this, it's like a nativity scene, sort of. So it's like King, is it Herod becomes Stalin, and
right.
Then the angels are armed Ukrainian nationalists, and the Jewish character is then transformed into this Jewish Bolshevik, stooge of the Soviet Union, and and then they decide to rebel against this Jewish character who is, taking all their grain. He and his wife go to Stalin and throw themselves at his knees and say, Stalin, they insult your most loyal servants, the Jews, and it's yeah, I don't know, it's just crazy.
Would you agree?
If we can just, oh, sorry, Jesse.
That's okay.
If we could just kind of go back to, sort of like 1929-ish, when, the OUNB was sort of, coming to be. We found out recently, I think it's important to point this out, especially given the situation that Ukraine finds itself in today, and that the United States finds itself in today, in that situation, is that, the CIA released or declassified some documents that showed that even then we were supporting Bandera. CIA was helping to protect and support Bandera. So, I mean, when we look at the situation that we're in today, I think that's an important through line to make. So can you talk a little bit about, how the CIA was working with Bandera and how that sort of, has carried through, the timeline?
Yeah, I've been recently revisiting the CIA files. So I'm glad we're talking about this. It's a little more complicated than that, just because so as I said, the Nazis did not support the independence of Ukraine, and Bandera, after the OUNB was assassinating some rivals in the other faction of the OUN, the OUNM, which was more patient with the Germans, and I think was closer with them to some degree. I don't know, but the Bandera and other OUNB leaders wound up in a German concentration camp as privileged political prisoners, and they were released before the war ended. But in the meantime, the interim leaders of the OUNB in Ukraine created this thing called the Supreme Liberation Council, which was ostensibly like this underground government of the resistance to the Soviets, and or of the OUN and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which massacred tens of thousands of Poles and several thousand Jews. And so the Germans had tried to utilize the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, as like this stay-behind force, and the CIA ends up doing basically the same thing. But it ends up working with this other group of OUNB leaders who essentially after World War II, the OUNB kind of splits in two again. And the CIA ends up working with the faction that is not Bandera's. And so it's working with all these people who were Banderites and who were with Bandera during the war, And then after the war are like, well, actually, no, we don't like fascism anymore. We're Democrats. We want to work with Eastern Ukrainians. We oppose the Nazis, blah, blah, blah. And whereas Bandera wasn't really willing to change anything. Mm-hmm. And so the CIA did not support Bandera in particular, but it ends up supporting his former comrades. And, in order to justify that, they had to basically whitewash the OUN. So it's like the CIA basically has this kind of double speak where it doesn't support Bandera and at the same time is whitewashing Bandera, more or less to justify working with Bandera's former people. And right. That group doesn't exist anymore that CIA was working with. Was that the OUNB? The OUNB still. Oh no, but wait, you said it was at the OUNM?
The OUB, the OUNM is defunct.
Actually, no, but the ex-Banderites that the CIA was working with, what was called the Foreign Representation of the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, no longer exists. But that was a really key relationship for the CIA. I mean, that relationship even predated the CIA's creation because the predecessor agencies of the CIA got hooked up with them in 1946, and the CIA is created the next year, and then really comes into being in 1948. And it was one of these Ukrainians that the CIA was working with was one of their longest. They worked with them throughout the entirety of the Cold War, and it had a lasting effect. Even if they weren't working with Bandera, it played a role in the whitewashing and then the rehabilitation of Bandera.
So I want to ask you about this alphabet soup of neo-Nazi and fascist groups that have existed or still exist in Ukraine, but building off of what you were just saying with regard to CIA manipulation, do you think that the U.S., at least after World War II, has viewed Ukraine as a proxy of sorts to manipulate, especially with regard to what was then Soviet and now Russian aggression? Because that's how it seems to me, that it's a pawn in this larger geopolitical game, and the carrot of NATO membership or EU membership is always dangled in front of Ukraine, or lethal weapon sales, but nothing much is ever fulfilled. Do you think that what we've seen in recent years is essentially what's been happening since the CIA started using Ukraine for its interests?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I think definitely Ukraine is definitely seen as a pawn today. I don't think John McCain or, people like him really cared, about the well-being of Ukrainians. But it's kind of complicated because it's like during the Cold War, the U.S. government was not explicitly trying, and the CIA wasn't even trying to do this, trying to break up the Soviet Union. That's what the Banderites wanted them to do. Mm-hmm. And by force, saying, support us, and we're going to lead this armed rebellion in Ukraine and throughout the Soviet Union, and we're going to overthrow it from within. And they had this idea that would not start World War III, but obviously it would. And so the U.S. government was not interested in doing that. And of course, the Soviet Union did collapse. And, George H.W. Bush has this sort of infamous speech he gave to the parliament in Soviet Ukraine, where he was seemingly advising against Ukraine becoming independent. It's known as his Chicken Kiev speech. And where he says something like, the U.S. will never support suicidal nationalism. And people took that to mean that he was suggesting that Ukraine becoming independent was suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think what he was really referencing was the Banderites, because he knew about Stetsko. He had Banderites. There was a minor scandal, even Stetsko was Bandera's first deputy in the war and then became the leader of the OUNB in 1968 to 86. And so he met Bush in 83, and if not again later, and then OUNB people had to resign from Bush's campaign in 1988, or the Ukrainians for Bush group. And so, I mean, I think Bush knew was referring to the Banderites when he talked about suicidal nationalism. And, George Kennan, who was the architect of U.S. containment of the Soviet Union and just Cold War strategy, he was not, the Ukrainian nationalists hated him. He once said that the relationship of Ukraine to the Soviet Union was akin to Pennsylvania to the United States, as in, like, why would you wouldn't, he was not saying let's break up the Soviet Union, at least let's not try to break off Ukraine from the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the CIA's interest and the U.S. government's interest in Ukrainians, I mean, it was kind of a carrot and a stick thing, and they were pawns. But I don't know that. It's just interesting because it's like the U.S. government was not. Again, it was speaking out of both sides of its mouth, because the CIA wanted to keep alive the spirit of Ukrainian nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't want it to get out of hand, essentially.
Right.
And of course, that's kind of what's happened today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you want to jump in with anything, or I can follow up with my question about all these different groups that have existed or do exist in Ukraine? So we talked about MNK, and then affiliated with them was Trident. Maybe you can talk about that. Right Sector, National Alliance, and then I believe the author of the play, Solomia Farion, the play we talked about, the band celebratory play. And then you have the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Svoboda Party, Ukrainian American Youth Association, where you start to get sort of the vector between U.S. geopolitics and Ukrainian geopolitics. And I understand that. And then the Education Assembly is another big one. I think you reported that they regularly hold classes or camps of some sort in upstate New York. But I do understand as well that there have been schisms among a lot of these groups. Can you talk about that, and which groups are primarily at the forefront of Neo-Nazism and fascism in Ukraine today?
Yeah. So just to go to the 90s, there was kind of mainly, I think, principally three different far-right groups. There was, first of all, just because my thing is on the OUNB, I'll just say the OUNB kind of created this, in trying to create a movement, they, often used with these far-right groups in Ukraine, if they want to call themselves a movement, what they'll do is they'll create a political wing, a youth wing, and a paramilitary wing. That's what the OUNB did in the 1990s, with the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists being its political wing, Trident being its paramilitary wing, and what was called the Youth Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists being its youth wing. That apparatus kind of ends up breaking apart, and I'm still hazy on the details of that, because admittedly I don't speak Ukrainian, which is kind of why I'm focused on the diaspora, where I can read English language material on this stuff. But so Trident later on in 2013 spearheaded the creation of Right Sector, although it had beef with the MNK, which is the successor group of the Youth Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists.
Mhm.
And so then also in the 90s, aside from that OUNB apparatus, you have the Social National Party of Ukraine, which, if that sounds a little Nazi-ish, I mean, their Wolf's Angel swastika kind of confirms that.
Yeah.
That was then rebranded as Svoboda in 2004.
Okay.
It also had a paramilitary branch, the Patriot of Ukraine,
Mhm.
which then was I believe then a branch of that then developed into the what ends up eventually becoming the Azov movement, which is also a three-pronged thing between a political paramilitary and I think a youth group. And Svoboda had a youth or paramilitary group, which then becomes C14 Sich, which is what created that education assembly you mentioned. And I think I'm forgetting. Oh, and then there was the Ukrainian in the 90s. There's the Ukrainian National Assembly, and then it was the UNA UNSO, which is like a political and then paramilitary thing, and that ends up joining Right Sector, and they still exist, but they're not as prominent, I don't think, today. But so today, you kind of, I think, I mean, I don't know. Personally, I kind of think of it this way, that in the far right, there's kind of a spectrum. You've got your neo-Nazis, and then you've got what you call the neo-N nationalists. And there is kind of like a gray area between them, where you've kind of got these like crypto Nazis, which is where I think kind of like Svoboda and even arguably Right Sector factor in, because
And when you say crypto, what do you mean by that?
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second. What'd you say?
When you say crypto, what do you mean by that?
Oh, as in, like, secretly, they're not overtly Nazis. They're more covert.
Right.
And, like there's kind of a thing, particularly with the left, where people are kind of quick to call Ukrainian nationalists Ukrainian Nazis. And, there are nationalists who are Nazis. But the problem with that is that, I mean, you do have hardcore neo-Nazis, who've got swastika tattoos and are murdering people and the like. And then you've got people who praise Bandera but insist that they're, Democrats. And they kind of walk the walk a bit, except, it's like the more moderate nationalists also have sympathies with the far right, and then in between you kind of have these like crypto Nazis, or we can call crypto Nazis. The Svoboda Party was, as I said, it was a social national party, neo-Nazi group, and then reinvents itself as basically a neo-nationalist group, even though it still has all these a lot of neo-Nazi elements in it. And Right Sector, as I said, was spearheaded by Trident, which was just like a hardcore neo-nationalist group. But then it also had neo-Nazi elements, which is what I wrote about in that article for the Gray Zone about this neo-Nazi woman.
And we'll link to that in the show notes. That's a great article, very timely and detailed, and that's one of the things I admire about your work, how much detail you go into, how much research is done. So
Thank you
for being one of the few voices to investigate this, what is already a huge problem but can potentially become a form of blowback for the US, for Ukrainians even. So
yeah, and that's, I mean, and that's happened already. I mean, because like I said, the CIA didn't support Bandera, and yet it's Bandera's people who kind of took over the Ukrainian American community, and also much of the organized Ukrainian diaspora, and they basically control the Ukrainian World Congress today. And part of that, it's like the CIA had hoped to unify the Ukrainian diaspora behind its group, but that didn't happen. So.
Mm-hmm. So, building off of that, can we speed up a little bit, or not speed up, but maybe jump to what happened in Maidan?
Mm-hmm.
It was 2013, correct?
Mm-hmm.
What happened in Maidan and the U.S. backing that was involved, and which groups they were supporting, which proxies they were sponsoring, and why you think they were sponsoring those proxies? Because I think there's a lot of confusion still about what happened in Maidan, and if you watch the Netflix documentary on it, you get this totally false sense of these are just civilian heroes who are being shot at indiscriminately, and the whole, it's not a narrative, it's what happened. The whole involvement of the US, of people like Barack Obama and Joe Biden supporting these proxy groups, these neo-Nazi and fascist proxy groups, it's a lot of people, even my father, who's Ukrainian, when I started to tell him about it, he was sort of dumbstruck, because it's obviously a story that doesn't get told a lot. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. For those who don't know, I mean, the Euromaidan, or what a lot of people who were in favor of it would call a revolution of dignity, was started in November 2013 in response to the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who admittedly was a corrupt, people. I was in Ukraine briefly in the summer of 2013, which is kind of how my interest in all this got started. At the time, I didn't really know anything about Ukraine, and all the people I met there, or I spoke to, they talked about Yanukovych like people here talk about Trump, like they just hated the guy. And so, when things started, I understood that it was a genuine protest movement responding to like legitimate grievances, and the main thing that people wanted was to Ukraine to join the EU. And over the course of the protest movement, or by the time Yanukovych was chased from Ukraine in February 2014, the far right had really just come to the far right and oligarchs, pro-Western oligarchs, had come to hijack the whole movement. And you asked about U.S. support. There was a trio of opposition leaders that the U.S. supported. The two of them were just center-right people, and then and the third was Ola Tyanibok, who was the leader of the Svoboda Party, which had its kind of breakout moment in 2012 in Ukraine's parliament, when it got, I think, 5% of the vote, which was, I think, just enough to get into parliament, and it was denounced by many around the world as a neo-Nazi party. So, I mean, the ugly side of the opposition leadership was clear. But then after Svoboda, right as things got started, Right Sector was created, which was kind of bringing together like a coalition of these far-right groups, which, as I mentioned, was led by the thoroughly but also very far-right paramilitary group Trident, but then it contained these other elements, some of whom were neo-Nazis. And Right Sector in particular kind of came to be like the vanguard of the of those who were fighting the police. And yeah, I mean, I think personally, I think I'm not totally convinced, or not. I'm just not convinced that the CIA or the U.S. government set out to create, a neo-Nazi coup, as people often talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Barack Obama had, I mean, you mentioned this massacre, which was I don't think there's really any question about it, was a false flag massacre. It seems orchestrated by the far right as a means to take power. Ivan Kachanovsky, who's a Ukrainian Canadian academic, has written about this. But the thing is, Obama had, as he admitted, brokered a deal that would see early elections come. I don't remember when, but later that year.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to negotiate like a peaceful settlement to this, and it's after that this deal was announced that this massacre happens, and then all of a sudden, it's all over. Yanukovych flees, and a lot of people would look at that and say, well, they couldn't have done that without, the CIA support. Although, again, when you look at 1941, when the OUNB tried to declare independence, what they were doing is they were trying to force the Nazis' hands in their favor, and Nazis didn't give in to that.
Mm-hmm.
So part of me thinks that it perhaps is more plausible that the presumably the far right Ukrainians who orchestrated this thing, did so as a way to force the hand of the U.S. and Western governments.
Mm-hmm.
Because
I think that the United States really has like a pretty well-documented history. This is kind of the typical game plan. They'll send infiltrators or whatever to jump inside of a legitimate movement and and flip it. And they do that a lot. They're trying to do it in Venezuela currently. This is something that Libya and Syria. This is a long history of the United, like this being the MO. And I think that WikiLeaks exposed a lot of stuff that did a lot of good in exposing the United States and its involvement in a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
But when the professor that you mentioned from Ottawa,
Mm-hmm.
his that whole reporting that he did on that and investigation into that is really fascinating. It kind of gives you like a brief look into an infiltrating force and how they operate. But I was kind of actually also wondering if you could speak to sort of how the United States involvement in situations like this gets so largely overlooked. We have the Russiagate hysteria, right? It's, everything. Rachel Maddow, they're going to turn your heat off in the middle of winter. And,
Mm-hmm.
There's this hysteria. But there's never any mention of, the Ukrainian influence or the United States influence in, Ukrainian politics or any of those things. Do you think that's just, obviously it's probably just the media propaganda and all of that. But what do you think sort of, leads us to a place where we can get people to understand these situations? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, so your question is how all this is managed to. Because I think, I agree with you that the U.S. Does have a long history of doing just insane things and trying to co-opt movements and I do also agree about the I'm not a Russiagator.
We aren't either.
Yeah, but I don't know. Because for me, it's like I look at this and I think this stuff has been fine on the radar for so long. At least the OUNB's continued existence that. For me, it'd almost be more of a surprise if it wasn't flying. It's like, I don't know. I think, I don't know. I guess I don't quite maybe understand exactly what you're asking me, but I think
I don't know if I even understand what I was trying to ask you, to be honest. Like
well,
it's just such a complicated issue that it's kind of overwhelming. I think maybe more of what I'm trying to ask is there's just such obvious um, uh, links. I mean, like I think you wrote in your piece about the Friends of Ukraine network, and how there's a crap ton of like these Atlantic Council dudes who are affiliated with this group, and one of them is an advisor to Joe Biden. It's like there's these obvious and direct links, and yet nobody talks about it. And again, I understand, our media sucks and there's a lot of propaganda, and it's spun this way for a reason. And I guess I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on, how we can combat that. I guess I'm like a big WikiLeaks activist. I'm like a big free press and access to information activist. So that's always kind of where my brain goes. So just, what do you think about the propaganda campaign that has surrounded this? And do you see a way that we can break through and like kind of get people talking about, what's being ignored?
Yeah, well, for me, it's I think it's partially, well, it's not the reason, but it's it's something that comes with focusing on the OUNBs, that like most people don't even realize that the OUNB still exists, and it's, I don't know. I mean, I think part of the reason they've been able to get away with it is because for decades, there's just been this narrative that that first, the CIA and the U.S. government kind of gave at least passive support to, that that the idea that Bandera and related the OUN, that they collaborated with the Nazis, was just Russian propaganda. And then, as I'm sure you both know, it becomes very easy to dismiss everything as Russian propaganda. And for many, to some extent, that's a relatively recent phenomenon, at least for some of my age in my life who grew up having no memory of the Cold War, grew up after the Cold War, was born after the Cold War ended. But for these Ukrainian nationalists who've been at the same game for decades, it's nothing new. But I do think talking about, I think the whole OUNB thing really shines a whole light on this, because in my opinion, the U.S. government role is, or I'll say the role of the Ukrainian diaspora and the organized Ukrainian American community and their support and relationship with the Ukrainian far right, in my opinion, is probably just as consequential, if not more so, than the U.S. government's. So I'm someone who would like to think that eventually the truth prevails. But I think, for me at least, focusing on the OUNB is a great way to kind of flip everything on its head, because, and I don't really understand why people haven't focused on this before, because it's like there's all the talk about Banderites and neo-Nazis have taken over Ukraine and so forth, but then no mention of the fact that it's literally Bandera's organization that has played such a role in forging all these links. Because part of the reason why U.S. politicians are even, I guess you could say, capitulating to Ukrainian nationalists is because they have a bunch of Ukrainian nationalists in their district, or that they are, particularly in the 80s, or I'm sorry, in the Cold War, the Ukrainian American community and other anti-communist, like what they would call ethnic outreach groups were, had a lot of influence.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think it's kind of been drilled into certain politicians, and it's the same old thing today.
Yeah, investigating this deeper, I was and still am surprised to see how entrenched in the Ukrainian nationalist ideology so many Ukrainians in the at least in the American diaspora of Ukrainians, how entrenched that thinking is, that ideology, even among my own family. And I understand where it comes from to an extent, because they were in Ukraine when it was under Soviet control. And I know people out there, some have a fetish for Stalin, but he was a horrible person. He committed horrible crimes. I don't think yes, the Red Army under his command basically, I don't want to say won World War II, but they carried the load, of course. But that doesn't make Stalin, in my opinion, any better of a person. And I think he did carry out pogroms against Jews, against Ukrainians, against a lot of populations and cultures. And I don't know what the exact numbers are from the famines that resulted from the disastrous collectivization plan, but I understand that, or I think a lot of the hatred that American Ukrainians in the diaspora have for Russia and the affinity they have for nationalism comes from this hatred for Stalin that's both based on truth and it's based on myth as well.
Mm-hmm.
Agree with that?
Yeah, no, and the Banderites have played a large role in shaping those myths. Because again, these nationalists, they're from Western Ukraine. They weren't in Soviet Ukraine. They weren't victims of the famine, rather. Mm-hmm. And yet the Banderites, hold themselves to be, even those who might be born in the U.S. and never step foot in Ukraine, they consider themselves the true spokespeople for all real Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. And so they've also been the ones who've been kind of leading the way about shaping the discourse about the famine. And they're the loudest ones who insist that it was a genocide, and not just a genocide, but a genocide that was just as bad and even worse than the Holocaust. I think most serious academics who've looked at it have estimated that the victims, which was 2 to 3 million, which is, you can't fathom that number. But mm-hmm. Then these Ukrainian nationalists insist, curiously, that it was 7 to 10 million. Mm-hmm. Today, I just tweeted about this today, the international leader of the OUNB is also the leader of the Ukraine World Congress's International Holodomor Committee. And mm-hmm. As others have written, to me, I've been thinking recently about how it's almost like it's okay. So if you criticize Israel, there are those who will say, "Oh, you must be an anti-Semite." But I've never criticized Israel and then had someone turn around and say, "Oh, are you a Holocaust denier?" Or, "Oh, that must mean you're a Holocaust denier." That's essentially what happens when you criticize Bandera, or at least that's what's happened to me. Is I've, posted something about these OUMB affiliated summer camps in the United States that teach Ukrainian American kids to praise Bandera, and then I'm getting angry messages from Ukrainian American kids who are like, "Oh, you deny that the Holodomor happened?" Like they've been taught to think that somehow Bandera and the Holodomor go hand in hand, or the famine, and that if you, and that's part of going back to that guy Yushchenko, the president who declared Bandera the hero of Ukraine. I mean, that was like the kind of twofold memory politics of his administration or his presidency, was the recognition of the famine or the Holodomor as a genocide, and then also the glorification of Nazi collaborators mm-hmm. as freedom fighters. And it's pretty transparent that the Banderites, I think their principal interest in this is to explain away and to distract from their own participation in genocide.
Right.
And it's really cynical and ugly. And because you say, you're a Holocaust revisionist, and they say, no, you're the genocide denier,
Right.
And it's they don't care. I mean, it's
just to be clear, nobody is denying that a famine happened under Stalin due to collectivization. But what we're saying here is that the facts have been manipulated beyond recognition, in a sense.
Well, I mean, the truth is that none of us really know history because it's been so bastardized and, game of telephone and, it's, and you only get to hear your country's version of history. And so, I mean, like Steve always says, my friend Steve from Slow News Day, the United States is probably the most propagandized country on earth. We have no idea about our history. I mean, Jesse, you and I have talked about this on other shows. So yeah, I think it's, people just do not, nobody really knows. Nobody really knows, it's just, I mean, we can make best guesses. We can look at, documentation and stuff like that. But even some of that stuff, could be, inaccurate or whatever. So yeah, it's crazy to think that, humanity has all of this history and we're not really sure how much of it's true, what's true. It's kind of nuts when you think about it. It makes my brain hurt a little bit. But I was actually wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit more specifically about like the sort of youth movements that we've been talking about. Because, as a mom, it freaks me out that there are these groups out there that are, indoctrinating and kind of brainwashing these kids into like this neo-Nazi sort of mentality. So can you talk about how that kind of provides strength for the movement and how pervasive these groups actually are in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, first to start talking about them here, the Ukrainian American Youth Association was created in 1949, and it's not as popular now, but I mean, to my knowledge, the oldest monument in the world built in Bandera's memory is in Ellenville, New York, at the Ukrainian American Youth Association. And they're not teaching them to be neo-Nazis so much, but I do kind of think of them as like the Bandera youth. I mean, it's kind of almost as if they had a bust of Hitler, but then they're teaching them that Hitler didn't do what he did, and so they're teaching them to glorify not Hitler as he was, but Hitler, an imaginary, fictional version of him. And
he could have been if he went a different way.
Yeah, but I mean, it does ingrain a sort of sympathy for Ukrainian far right. I mean, this MNK, or the Youth Nationalist Congress that we're talking about with the anti-Semitic annual play, they've gone and given lectures and ideological workshops at this camp, and those people have worked, alongside neo-Nazis. They are not necessarily neo-Nazis themselves, but they, in the same way that, Bandera and his people during World War II weren't Ukrainian Nazis, they were Ukrainian Nazi collaborators.
Right.
That's kind of, a lot of the people that I'm focusing on are not neo-Nazis themselves, but neo-Nazi collaborators. And I mean, I think it's probably a lot more intense in Ukraine. The the same youth association that's in the U.S. is an international thing. So they have a group, they have branches in Canada, in Australia, and in Ukraine. But this other group, the Youth Nationalist Congress, is much more hardcore. And then the neo-Nazis also have their own youth groups. In right sectors, I think it's called Right Youth, and in this article, I mean their symbol it's not a swastika, it's almost swastika-esque. And so when I was writing this article for the Gray Zone, I went and looked at their Facebook page, and I found this picture of 4 kids pretending to sleep, and they're in the shape of a swastika, and it's like the way that they're laying down is very clearly like no one sleeps like that, So it's I don't know. I mean, it's at the very least, I would say, I don't know that these youth groups are necessarily raising people to be neo-Nazis, but raising them to be more like neo-Nazi sympathizers and apologists.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, I think, an important distinction. Not that it makes them any better, but it's an important distinction you make at the end of one of your most recent pieces on your website, which we'll link to in the show notes, is that not all of these actors are neo-Nazis or fascists, but they are still associating with and supporting in some way those factions.
And that's, I think the distinction is important, because otherwise it makes it very easy for them to dismiss it as Russian propaganda, which of course they're going to do anyways. But it's I don't know.
So to bring or to clarify the vector between Ukrainian nationalism and neo-Nazi entities, the vector between them and the US, I first want to read this paragraph from one of your recent pieces, which we'll again link to, but I think it very much illuminates the connection the US has now to these groups and why it's supporting them, why it's considering arming and equipping them. So this is from Moss's recent piece. You can find it on his website, and again, we'll link to it in the show notes. In recent years, these annual performances around the country, the plays we were talking about earlier, have served to fundraise for the MNK's Free People, Vilny Lyudi, or VL, an NGO and sort of Banderite proto-party that last year spearheaded the launch of the rightist movement to resist capitulation, Ruk Oporo Capitulacji, I'm sure I butchered that, ROK. Largely an MNK creation, the ROK has been erroneously described as a, quote, democratic movement, unquote, by the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert, which can be explained in part by the AC's own ties to the Banderites. The MNK, VL, and ROK tellingly all have an office in the OUNB's headquarters building in Kiev, the Stepan Bandera Center for National Revival. So I think there you start to sort of, again, illuminate this vector between U.S. geopolitics and Ukrainian geopolitics, which brings us up to where we are now and your recent piece for the Gray Zone. And can you talk about that? How, I don't want to say infiltration, because that strikes me as the wrong word, but essentially how these two geopolitical entities have infiltrated each other in a sense, and clearly the U.S. is getting more out of the symbiotic exchange than Ukraine is. But for example, Andrei Parubi was invited to speak in Washington not too long ago, if I'm not mistaken. Can you talk about how it's not only becoming mainstreamed in American politics, but it's out in the open? It's basically, we'll invite these people and these are the people we're going to support, and we don't care if they have a stormtrooper patch on their uniform.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, I think it's all product of this history of decades of infiltration. And that's exactly what it is infiltration by the OUNB. They infiltrated Nazi auxiliary police units before they joined the Ukrainian insurgent army. They infiltrated the Ukrainian diaspora. They've more or less infiltrated, some of the think tanks, or at least, have made friendships, made contacts there. And it's, for me, I think it's all a result of that, which, again, I think it's only possible because the U.S. and the CIA and so forth, looked the other way as it was happening. Parobi he may not be a member of the OUNB today, but he's certainly a friend of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of, when you look at Parobi's his visits to the United States, at least I think in 2015 and 2016, were organized by representatives of the OUNB, and they were arranged by them, and so have others prominent Ukrainian nationalists who've gotten these tours of the U.S. where they come to Washington and they get to speak to various experts, and so that's very much, I think, an example of how the OUNB apparatus serves as a bridge. And I also suspect that some of their clout in Ukraine vis-a-vis these other right-wing nationalist groups is that access that they have to the diaspora and the friends of the Ukrainian diaspora, because they can bring in, as in the paragraph you read, free people fundraises mostly from Canada, and so I mean it's they've kind of got the faucet of money coming from the diaspora, and I don't think any other political group in Ukraine is supported and is so close with the leading figures in the Ukrainian diaspora.
Right. And just to clarify for viewers who might not be familiar, Andriy Parubi, and I'm quoting from your piece again, he's a white nationalist chairman of Ukraine's parliament, or he was from 2016 to 2019, who co-founded the 1990s neo-Nazi Social National Party of Ukraine. And as we mentioned,
and now
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, now or at least he was elected in the last parliamentary elections in Ukraine, 2019. He was the number 2 on Poroshenko's new European Solidarity Party. So it's and there's several others in that party who are either members of the OUNB or friends of them. And so they've really, they're now tied to Poroshenko. The previous president of Ukraine, which is right. Who's the one who Biden said he talked to, I think, more than his wife.
Right. And maybe it's a tangent, or maybe not, but regarding Biden, what are your thoughts on his son's ties to Burisma and the admission Biden made about essentially blackmailing the Attorney General of Ukraine for whatever whatever largesse was waiting?
Well, I think first of all, I was very surprised to see Hunter Biden address the Democratic National Convention. I mean, how I thought, how is Burisma not fair game,
right,
to Republicans after you have the son after you have him
let's be
address the
honest,
Democratic
though.
National Convention.
They
I'm sorry?
they let Bill Clinton speak. So, I mean, and they had like a bunch of neocons. So Hunter Biden just totally makes sense. It fits,
Mhm.
it fits right in.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I guess in truth, he's really far from the most problematic person to speak at the convention.
He's probably the most problematic.
I think I understand that the whole issue with Biden, I mean, yeah, with Hunter Biden and Burisma is, not quite what some people make it out to be. But it's certainly not a good look, that the U.S. plays a strong role behind the scenes. That
when you say that it's not what a lot of people make it out to be, what do you mean by that?
Well, I don't think. All right, admittedly, I tend not to dive that deep into the stuff with Ukraine that people are already like focusing on. For instance, the Hunter Biden thing and Chrystia Freeland in Canada, being the granddaughter of a Nazi collaborator.
Right.
Just because, I mean, there's already others focusing on that, and and it's not really directly my thing, so I don't think I feel like I have much to add. But yeah, I don't know. People make it out to be that the prosecutor that Biden had removed was, this like anti-corruption crusader,
Right.
and that it's like as if had Biden not intervened, that he would have brought down the whole house of cards with Hunter Biden and Burisma, and I don't think that's the case. I think maybe more.
I agree.
I think Max Blumenthal, wrote a really interesting and illuminating article about the whole Burisma thing, and it seems almost like a bigger deal is the fact. I think it's the CEO of Burisma, or the group that Burisma is a part of, that is a significant contributor to the Atlantic Council, and just in that whole thing about how the Atlantic Council kind of peddles foreign influence,
right?
But yeah, I mean, it's wild that to see how central Ukraine has become to, I mean, all the stuff with Trump in the last several years. I mean, and because also, I mean, it's like, it makes sense, not just because Ukraine is Russia's neighbor, but because this whole new Cold War with Russia basically started with the Ukraine crisis. And
I think that's kind of what this whole thing all shows, though, is that, the Democratic side wants to try to paint Trump as this, just crazy corrupt guy, this crazy corrupt business guy with all these shady ties to all these people. And really, the whole Ukraine situation just shows that that's true across the board. That's not a Trump thing. That's an everybody in Washington thing. They all have shady ties to corrupt people, and they're all corrupt, and they're all making deals. And it's I think that's kind of really what it illuminated for me, is that this isn't just a Trump thing. Well, I guess it didn't illuminate it because I was aware of it before, but I mean, that's kind of just what it should show people, that this is not a one side or the other type deal. This is, all of our politicians are doing this kind of crap across the board. So yeah, that's just, I mean, it like you said, was it as big a deal as, some people made it out to be? Probably not. But it is still, but the Trump stuff, was it as bad as no, bombshell after bombshell was debunked, and, whatever. So I think that's just kind of what it's shown to me. And I'm hoping that other people will realize that these people are all corrupt. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to the point that we made earlier, that Ukraine for decades now has been essentially a pawn, a proxy for, I think, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and now Russia as well.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that they're using Ukraine. They're trying to use Ukraine against each other. It's like it's the ping pong ball. It's just getting batted back and forth, and they're like stuck in the middle of these two superpowers, um, ruled by psychopaths who are fighting over it. I mean, you had
Yeah.
Newland and Biden in like with the 2014 when all of that stuff was going on. They were heavily involved. I mean, John McCain was going over there. Chris Murphy went over and gave a big speech, and
Hmm.
like all of these high level politicians were going over there and trying to influence public opinion and all of these things. And it's all of them. So yeah, I think that's hopefully what will start coming across as more and more of this stuff comes out, which is why I'm grateful to you for covering this in such an interesting way. Like Jesse mentioned
Thank you.
earlier, I hadn't really examined it from the aspect that you have been. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of journalists and journalism, and well, good journalists and good journalism. So yeah, like that's just, it's hopefully the more that this gets talked about, that'll, be sort of what people pick up from it.
Mm. Thanks. And it's funny because I never set out to be a journalist. This was just a historical research project. I was just kind of interested in the whole, just because there's just so much crazy Cold War history involving the OUNB, and it's just really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then I find out, I thought I was approaching the end of this journey when I visited the cemetery in New Jersey, Ukrainian cemetery in New Jersey, to see the grave of the CIA's top guy, Ukrainian they were working with, Mykola Abed.
And you said that's where in New Jersey?
In Southbound Brook, New Jersey.
So,
And, yeah.
full disclosure to viewers, my grandparents on my father's side and my uncle on my father's side are buried in the cemetery. So,
Well, it's a large cemetery, but there is a section of it that is dedicated to veterans of the UPA, or the OUNB's Ukrainian Surgeon Army. And I was just going there for this guy, Mykola Abed, who was arguably a bigger war criminal than Bandera, but he then, decides he's a Democrat and not a fascist, allegedly. And, it's good enough for the CIA. And they protected him, and he died in the 90s. And but then when I get there, I realize he's buried next to all these other guys who are Nazi turned CIA collaborators. And it was then in looking further into some of the people buried there, in this section, that I came across the summer camp in Ellenville, and I realized and I came to then venture soon thereafter realize the OUNB still exists. And so it's kind of almost through that basically accidental discovery that this became even a journalistic thing. So it's been a while. That's only a year ago. So.
Yeah, I think that most of the best journalists didn't start out to become journalists. I mean, there are some who started out to become journalists who become amazing journalists, but I think a lot of it's accidental. I think some of my favorite journalists were like accidental, like they just kind of fell into it. So I think that's, totally, reasonable.
So Moss, before we wrap up, there are just a few more things I'd like to ask you about just to get your perspective on them. One of them being Russia's so-called invasion of Crimea and occupation of Crimea, and the flight that was shot down over Crimea, over Ukraine in 2014, and the Bellingcat analysis of that, and your overall sense of what the future might hold for that region, for Crimea, for the Donbass and other areas nearby.
Yeah. Well, the MH17, the plane that was shot down, is another thing that, I kind of decided, it's probably better just to leave it to people who are studying this more in depth. And
right.
I think, Bellingcat has in the last year or two has turned its attention towards Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and I think they've done a really good job at that, and I'm glad to see that. I think, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the future holds. I think I just saw something about, the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, hopes to end the war in eastern Ukraine. He said even as soon as this year. At the same time,
a comedian, whom we should add is a former comedian or maybe he's still a comedian with no political experience.
Yeah, and and then he won an unprecedented, 73% of the vote, I think it was.
Yeah,
and the Banderites, or the OUNB, seems to want to overthrow him in concert with the Ukrainian far right and the neo-Nazis. And people talk about the 2013-2014 Maidan as as having culminated in a so-called neo-Nazi junta, but I think that's what might actually end up happening if they get their way and actually were to overthrow Zelensky.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's he's in a tough spot, not just with these nationalists, but he says he wants to end the war, but at the same time, he can't surrender Crimea. He has to say that Crimea will return to Ukraine.
Right.
And it's very hard to imagine how that's going to happen. So, it's hard to imagine, if you were in his position, how do you, how do you do that? How do you end the war without just so-called capitulating to, in terms of giving away Crimea? And I don't know. I'm not, again, it's like I don't speak Ukrainian, and so my focus is mainly on the diaspora, and so I'm not as much informed or really someone to analyze the situation in Ukraine as far as Crimea and the war goes.
Right. I bring it up not to test your geopolitical, but because I think a lot of the Ukrainian diaspora we've been talking about are very, or their Russophobia has been amped up, especially since the invasion of Crimea. Whatever you want to call it, I'm not really concerned about the technical terms.
Mm-hmm.
The people there seem to have their own opinion on what they want to do, so I leave it up to them. But I think a lot of just in my experience, the people I know in the Ukrainian diaspora, both family and friends, they're very, I'm not going to say nationalistic, but it's like Crimea is Ukraine, Russia needs to get the fuck out, and that's that, and that's the whole story. And we all know it's a lot more complex than that, but I think that the diaspora still has a huge influence on the narrative of what's happening there in eastern Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
I am kind of curious what your thoughts are more on how this will influence United States politics. I don't really follow like horse race Biden versus Trump. Jesse and I are that's not really our thing. But I am curious as to how you think that this will influence sort of the kind of mood in the country. And obviously it's going to be it'll hinge very much on the outcome of the election.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, obviously I think that, Russiagate was kind of invented to, help the Clinton campaign cover up for their horrible, whatever. But then like it just seems like like we said earlier, it's like a ping pong ball being bounced back and forth. And I'm just kind of curious, if you have any thoughts on how that's going to influence the political climate in this country, moving up to the election and then beyond.
Yeah, well, let's just say, assuming Biden wins, I'm not confident at all that he will. But hypothetically, I mean, I think a Biden administration is going to be super hawkish when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. And the thing that makes me, I mean, among other things, that makes me kind of uncomfortable about that is, I assume Michael Carpenter will remain Biden's point person on Ukraine, and he's demonstrated that he's basically an apologist for the Ukrainian far right, and if not a friend of the OUNB, he's spoken at.
Can you quickly tell who Michael Carpenter is, just for people who?
Yeah, I think he was an assistant secretary of defense or something like that. But he's and now he's the director of what I think is called the Biden Penn Center.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's I don't know. Yeah, he's been referred to as one of Biden's point people on Ukraine when he was vice president. And Max Blumenthal kind of confronted. I don't know if confronted was the word, but when Parubi was one of the times he spoke in Washington, he spoke in an event organized by the American Foreign Policy Council, which I've also recently written about, how that is the think tank that is closest. I mean, I think they know exactly what they're doing. I mean, I think
if you'll let me, can I read a paragraph from your recent piece?
Sure.
Where you talk about this?
Mm-hmm.
The Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations, allegedly led by the U.S. leader of the OUNB, has helped hook up Andriy Livas, who is an MNK member, the head of VL, which we mentioned earlier, and seemingly the de facto leader of the ROK, with prominent hawks in Washington, such as the longtime president of the hardline American Foreign Policy Council. So just to give some context to what you're saying.
Yeah, I think I tried to attend one of their events, the Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations, which, for the sake of time, I won't go into it, but people can read about it on my blog. I mean, I don't really have much doubt that it's more or less a front for the OUNB, and it always has been. But I tried to attend one of their events, and I walked in during when Michael Carpenter was speaking, or at least when he was on the panel discussion. And one of the guys who runs the DC Bureau of the Center for U.S.-Ukraine Relations, which is located in the premises of the American Foreign Policy Council, he actually got up off the panel to escort me out of the room before I could, ask Michael Carpenter, does he realize who, he's dealing with?
Wow.
Which I suspect that's why they have. I mean, I don't know. That's what I wanted to ask. I mean, that was, and I think it's, but yeah, no, I mean, I think it's only going to get worse in terms of this basically Ukrainian nationalist inspired rhetoric. Canada is kind of I've seen people say that, the U.S. is, for Canada, a vision of its future. But in a way, in terms of when it comes to Ukraine, I think Canada is kind of a vision of our future.
Let's talk about for a little bit, if we can, because I know in our exchanges you mentioned Canada and recent political developments there vis-a-vis Ukraine. So if you can break that down a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, and so this was the first article I ever wrote for the Gray Zone was about the OUNB's connections to the Conservative Party, because people tend to know about Chrystia Freeland, who many think will be, not the next prime minister, the next, leader of the Liberal Party or the Labour Party, and but the Banderites, they're pretty conservative. They tend to vote conservative, and before Trump came around, at least they're pretty solidly Republican voters in the United States, and so I think there's more Ukrainians in the United States, but there's more per capita in Canada, and particularly in Western Canada, there's parts of Western Canada that Ukrainians are the largest minority, if not, I think, an outright majority in some more rural parts of Western Canada. And they, I don't know, it's wild because basically they have a parliamentary system, so it's not just both sides. I think it's all sides, basically. The Labour Party, the NDP, the Conservative Party, basically, they're very careful not to offend the Ukrainian population of Canada, which organizationally is led by these Banderites. It's not that all or even most Ukrainians or in Canada are either Canadians of Ukrainian descent, and the same in the U.S. It's not that they're all Banderites and far right-wingers, but someone else was explaining it to me. It's like if you're an average Ukrainian in Canada, you may participate in cultural things and groups, but average people are not trying to take over the community. It's like these Banderites in particular are extremely focused on, as we said earlier, infiltrating and just taking over everything they can, because they have this like basically fascist ideology, or at least that's part of it, and I don't know, they've already succeeded. And so whereas the Conservative Party is not explicitly, but pretty friendly with the actual Banderites themselves, and so it's, I don't know, it's just a much more sort of intense situation where like Ukrainian nationalists have a lot more influence in Canada than they do in the US. And so when someone spray painted "Communism will win" on a sign, not even the monument, because I think it's still being built, but we have like a Victims to Communism memorial in DC, and they're building one in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
And someone spray painted "Communism will win" on a signpost, like on the fence of the construction site, and it became this huge deal because the Ukrainian Canadian Congress denounced it as basically like a hate crime. And then of course there was the memorial to the Ukrainian division of the SS, or the Waffen SS, and someone pretty accurately spray painted it saying "Nazi War Monument," and that was then briefly investigated as a hate crime, presumably because the Ukrainian community reported it as one to the police.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, they just had their leadership election for the Conservative Party, and the guy who won, Eric O'Toole, is pretty friendly with the Banderites. He's having photos with members of the MNK, this youth group that's done the anti-Semitic play, which the Banderites in Canada in particular are trying to promote as much as possible. And so it's like in Canada, we're looking at potentially like where it could be Chrystia Freeland versus Eric O'Toole.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like whichever you get, is going to be pretty friendly to the Ukrainian nationalist community. And Biden, I think, is certainly going to be one to capitulate and to have Ukrainian nationalist interests,
Moderate rebels.
Yeah.
Well, he's already shown that he's he's fine with that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Justin Trudeau, I just noticed the other day, every year since 2015 has, tweeted Slava Ukraini on Ukraine's Independence Day,
Really?
which is, and which for people don't know, I mean, that it's been mainstreamed since the Euromaidan, but it does have a fascist origin story. And, he should know that, but
I think he probably does know that. I think that's really kind of the problem. I like to call him Canadian Obama. Yeah, he's something else. Yeah, but I think that that's kind of why this is important to talk about, because I think that this is more of like a global fascism type thing that we've seen kind of rising over the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years. I mean, we see it with like Bolsonaro and I mean, the stuff that's happening in Ukraine. And so I think that like bigger picture, I mean, Trump has fascist leanings for sure. So I just think that this is kind of just another piece of that, right wings, resurgence or whatever you want to call it. It's kind of happening globally, that I don't think enough people are paying attention to. I know that, like in the US, we have our own shit to worry about. There's a lot going on, but I just, a lot of this is getting lost in the bigger picture conversation, I think. So, yeah, like you said, Canada's even worse than we are. And, it's something that I think people need to start focusing on more. I think people get too wrapped up in like team mentality and, cult of personality and all that stuff, and they're missing the bigger picture and the nuances of the bigger picture, really.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
I agree. And I suppose last question, Moss, what do you think the end game is for these Ukrainian nationalists and fascists and neo-Nazis? What in your estimation are they hoping to achieve? Obviously they're making moves and organizing and consolidating, but what is their, if what is their larger vision?
They want Ukraine to be just for Banderites.
Mm-hmm.
They think real Ukrainians praise Bandera. I think that's, they have some principles other than that, but I mean, I think that's the main thing, is they want everyone to, glorify Bandera. I mean, I think even the leader of the Svoboda Party, which I think, when I think about it more, I guess probably does, I think, deserve more the label of more crypto-Nazi than outright neo-Nazi, but I don't think it's not unfair to call it a neo-Nazi party. I mean, he made a speech where he was saying, and he said, and he's like, if we don't leave Ukraine for the Banderites, then what has this all been about? Like, they just, I mean, he very explicitly said, what is our goal? It's to leave, Ukraine should only be for Banderites. And I don't think that necessarily means we need to take out everyone who isn't a Banderite, but that they, it's a long-term project.
Mm-hmm.
And the youth stuff that they've been able to do in the last 5-6 years, I think, as these people come of age, they're going to see that's paid a lot of dividends towards their end game.
That's pure indoctrination. And we didn't get to hit on the Azov battalion much, but I think we should mention that they are essentially incorporated into the Ukrainian military government apparatus at this point. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's again, like other groups, it's a multi-pronged movement. The Azov battalion is the one that gets the most attention, but then they also have this political party, the National Corps. And I mean, I've seen it in person. I mean, it is very fascist. I mean, I was in Odessa for the 5th anniversary of the massacre in the trade unions house, the building that was burned on May 2nd, 2014, which, was Eastern people in Eastern Ukraine was largely like a catalyst for the war. And, you're not allowed to call it a civil war. But I think Azov is really scary. And they're the ones who, they weren't, I think they grew out of what was called the Social National Assembly, which was part of Right Sector. And, at the time it was Right Sector was the one that people were talking about, like, that's the one to watch out for. And it still is, but it's really Azov is the one, I think, that is probably the strongest. And, like I've written before, it's like these Banderites, they are not neo-Nazis. They don't necessarily support Azov, but they will work together, and they are working together. And if they succeeded to have another protest movement or another color revolution or whatever you want to call it, I think it's gonna be Azov that really is the one that powers that, and
benefits.
They're the ones who, if they were to ever take power, that's when you'd really, I think, have the neo-Nazi regime that, a lot of people kind of mistakenly think Ukraine already is.
Right. Yeah. It's not there yet, but there are so many elements vying to make it that. And I think that's another primary point, is that Ukraine is not a neo-Nazi country or nation state yet, but there are so many entities, as I said, vying to make it that way. And I think that's why reporting like yours before it happens, calling it out is very important. So thank you so much for your work, and thank you for joining us, Moss.
Thank you.
We'd love to have you back on anytime. There's, like I said at the very beginning, this is a extremely complicated, complex issue. So anytime you want to come.
I'm sorry. I wish I was a little more articulate.
No, you're fine. We're just trying to hash it all out ourselves too. Like it's just trying to have conversations. But yeah, anytime you want to come back on and talk about any other aspect of this, or if you come across some new information or have a new piece out or whatever, we'd always love to have you back on. This is a conversation we could have for years and still never really talk about it all. So anytime you want to come back on, you're welcome to do so.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Moss, where can people find you online?
Oh, I have a Twitter. It's Moss Robeson __. I think I made a previous account, Moss Robeson. It got suspended at some point. I don't remember that. But and then I've got a Substack, which is called Bandera Lobby, the Bandera Lobby blog. So it's banderalobby.substack.com.
We'll link to all that in the show notes too, so people can find you and find your work.
And just real quick, are there any other sources you'd recommend for people who want to look deeper into this?
Yeah, if I were to name names, I'm thinking more of historical stuff. There's a great, I think a great place to start would be the biography that came out in 2014 about Stepan Bandera, by an author or an academic, Rosolinsky-Liebe is his last name. And it's quite incredibly the first scholarly biography of Bandera that's been published. And so, there really is, it's kind of wild that this late that there would be so much pioneering scholarship about Ukrainian nationalism and the Banderites, but that's what it is, which is, it's better late than never. So there's a lot of good information out there.
And if you're using your starting point as World War II, which I don't think is the official starting point, but if you're starting from World War II, it has not been that long that Ukrainian nationalism's been, I don't want to say flourishing, more like festering. So in a way, yes, it is surprising, given all the technology and resources we have now, that it hasn't been investigated more and exposed more. But at the same time, it hasn't been that long, and it's coming to the surface, and I think that's a good thing. I think it affects more than just Ukrainians. It affects Americans. It affects Russians. It affects people who live in countries that surround Ukraine. And people need to know about it, because I think it's a geopolitical. I'm going to borrow from Reagan here when he was talking about the Arab Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War. He said it's a choke point for geopolitics. I'm paraphrasing, but he did use the word choke point. So I feel like Ukraine has become that sort of entity with regard to geopolitics for the US, for Russia, etc. So
Stephen F. Cohen has said it's like it could very well be our Cuba, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in his opinion, it's actually much more dangerous.
Yeah, and I think he's.
Speaking of good sources on Ukraine, there's one.
Yeah, he's one of the best voices on Russian relations, Ukraine. So if you don't know Stephen F. Cohen, Professor Stephen F. Cohen, definitely check out his work. And Moss, thank you very much again for joining us. Our guest today has been Moss Robeson. He's an independent journalist and researcher who's investigated Ukraine and its neo-Nazi, fascist, nationalist tendencies extensively. We'll link to his website and to his Twitter account and any other ancillary information we might have covered that will be of interest. So, Moss, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
All right, bye.